Alrighty. Welcome everybody to episode 3. We have a name finally. So going with Beyond the Weight Room took us a little bit of time, but I think that one fits really well because obviously we're going to talk a lot about strength conditioning here, but a lot of our conversations usually veer off to different paths, and we kind of bounce all over the place a little bit. So I know today, as we're getting going here, we're really trying to nail down on specific topics as we oops, I think I just muted you. Yeah, we're good now. I think, nail down specific topics before we talk, just kind of get things rolling a little bit. So today I gave this one to Ryan to figure out, and he wanted to talk a little bit about injuries, since that's something that we both deal with on a regular basis, and either fortunately or unfortunately have kind of become, actual pros at. So Ryan, I'm gonna let you talk first because I don't know specifically what you're wanting to get into.
Firstly, I think it should be addressed that there was no shortage of name submissions. There were quite a few.
That's fair. We put this out on the internet, and that was a bad idea. A lot of Confessions from a Beef Barn was, I think, number 2 for me. So.
Well, it's good to see that people are interested, at least.
Bod Pod, that was a decent one.
That was,
but most people don't understand the reference, so we just went past that one. Mm-hmm. But landed on something basic because a lot of the ones my wife was giving me, people would either think it was a deli podcast or some type of, erotic podcast, we'll say.
Who knows? Like maybe we'll expand our horizons as we continue this journey.
Speaking of, I am just crushing some pre-workout right now. I'm going to plan on lifting after this. I'm really hoping I timed this correctly. I'm not just peeling my face off in the middle of this. So
I think
let's get rolling.
Well, I think the thing that I wanted to talk today about, and we can go quite a few different directions with this, is just injuries, not necessarily mechanisms of injuries, but more of training with injuries, training around injuries. Our approaches with athletes, general population, we can kind of flourish this out however we want it to be. And I'm sure this will be a multi-part conversation that we have going through injuries. But I think a big thing that, everybody is going to deal with at some point in their career is training individuals that are injured and coming up with the right plan of action, whether it be an athlete or not, is something that takes time to develop, especially in the communication aspect. And I think that's something where you can definitely talk on, and I can as well, just with communication with inner department and being in sports medicine and using everything and all the resources available to us when we make our decisions in the weight room. And it's really, at a certain point, not just our decision, but it's a multi-handed, coordinated effort to help this person return to sport, return to play, return to general life.
Yeah. This is obviously I didn't know exactly what you wanted to talk about. You just said injuries, but it's kind of crazy. I literally had a meeting like 3 hours ago with Anthony Hopgood, who's I forgot his new position technically with Exos, but he's one of the top guys in Exos performance with the NFL. He's been there forever. He came out and visited our site, saw how much we did with injury, and specifically partnered up with our therapist. I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit. He shared, how they communicate really with their therapist. You might not be at the same site as your therapist. It's easy when you're sitting next to them, right? Or when you're traveling with them in your sense. But if it's somebody from a different clinic across the state or across the country, if you're working with NFL guys potentially, making sure everybody's on the same page and talking the same language is huge. So he shared with me kind of a document they did, where basically they went through the whole Exos methodology of our pillar prep, our movement skills, our strength, if you're familiar with Exos, really all the different levels of the system. And then within that, like a ranking from what everybody could do. So 0 was like, pretty much can't do any of that. 4 being like, no, they can do whatever they want, like full go. So they kind of would go through almost weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the injury, and access probably to the therapist, and met with the therapist and talked with them literally down each pathway. It's like, all right, pillar prep, that's probably gonna be a pretty basic one that most people can do pretty early on. Once we start getting into the movement skills, are they early stage ACL rehab? Do we have to be doing no impact, but maybe we can do movements. We're at like a level 1, right? Can we start doing impact? We can't do lateral. So maybe your lateral is a level 2 with no impact, and your linear movements are a level 3. They can have impact, but they're not full cleared yet to like reaction, which is level 4, right? So I think having, you can develop it however you want to, but having some type of plan like that shared with your therapist and, laid out as clean as possible, I think is something that's very big. And I know when we were at the ski team, we did a good job of doing that, is having that same terminology back and forth. So when somebody's out on the floor, you can be like, hey, they're a level 2 at plyos, and you just know what that means. So you don't have to sit there and talk about it and send me a paragraph or, go through too much that way. So I think it's kind of funny. We just had that meeting today, actually.
Well, and there's a lot of ways to do it. And I've seen good and bad departments and organizations that have really good communication, because the ultimate sacrifice of having poor communication is an athlete that either physically doesn't get to where they need to go on a timely manner, because of the inability to communicate, or just from an emotional standpoint, they lose trust in the process of rehab or working through an injury, because they can sense that communication amongst those helping them is not up to the standard. And I think that's a big one, especially as you get into higher level athletics, is these athletes are not dumb to the sense of knowing what's going on. Like the modern day athlete is very, very smart, and they realize what their best interest is, as they should. So if there's a lack of communication or a breach in communication between a PT, an ATC, a strength coach, a mental skills coach, what have you, an on-field coach, like if those things don't line up, the modern day athlete's going to try to poke holes and figure out what that weak point in the chain is.
And they can usually feel that too, like in my sense too, like even if it's not, well, usually athletes, but even if it's not like a high level athlete, like the athlete and the parents can kind of see how there's like questions sometimes, right? Of, all right, why wasn't this addressed, right? And whose fault is that? So keep going.
Yeah. And ultimately, like I said, it comes down to they're at the sacrifice, at the will of some of this training. And there's things that obviously go outside of our ability to help and outside of our scope. And that's where our communication with our physical therapists and athletic trainers matters, because at the end of the day, we're kind of bottom line on the floor with them. Like they are the ones that ultimately make the decisions if we can progress, if they're talking with their surgeon as well. And we have to react to that. And there are going to be athletes that come to you and they know what they were told, and they're going to ask you for your opinion. And that's when the whole game of making sure that you're staying in line with their correct progression is there.
Cover your ass. Yeah. I think that's again why communication is so key, and having it written down ideally. And I always refer back, whether I'm talking to a therapist or talking with a parent, I'm always like, the therapists are going to clear you for this stuff. Like if I get somebody, and even if I feel like that they're looking great and they can potentially progress, I'm not going to do that in that one session without talking to that therapist, which might be a week or two. Mm-hmm. Like unfortunately, sometimes people are traveling and stuff, but until I'm cleared from them, because they're the one that's in charge of them, and I make sure they know that, I'm not going to just go and do that. And I think a lot of times that's the biggest thing with maybe young coaches I see is, we're used to progressing and seeing people in a specific way because they're just training, right? So if they're going through rehab, a lot of times we see these things that we, in our mind, I think, know progresses to whatever the next movement pattern is at a certain speed that we're used to. And you can't always do that with that rehab because it takes longer for that graft to hold or whatever. And a good example of that, I always tell my ACL athletes, like, you get to that 4 or 5 month mark, that's usually like a really hard time, I think, for athletes, because they feel fine. They're moving fine. They feel like their old selves generally, maybe some knee stiffness, but they're starting to skip and starting to run and stuff. And they're not necessarily thinking about how that graph is healing up, how everything hasn't really been moving in 4 months, and how things have shut down just because they feel normal. And as a strength coach, if you're not used to that, you could just see them moving like normal. and kind of progress almost too fast. And I think
Mhm.
making sure you know when to pull the reins back on your athlete and yourself as a coach if you're new to that.
And that ultimately comes down to the knowing your athlete, knowing who you're working with, and depending on what level you're at and how many hours of exposure you have with them, that ultimately changes that conversation. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to have a solid relationship with the athlete where you don't feel like they're holding things back
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah, we
they
talked about
are either
positive
trying
communication.
to get back on the field or they're playing through something. Because ultimately, every athlete's going to play through some pain and through some injury. But when does that become too much, and when are they actually doing more damage to themselves? In the case of something a little bit more chronic than just like an ACL, right? And you talked about it, and we talked about it a couple podcasts ago. Like a lot of injuries are not linear in progression. There are things that are going to have setbacks, especially with major traumatic injuries. And then with chronic injuries, like you're going to have flare-ups. You're going to experience inflammation and these things that do not always progress the way that they say in the textbook, right? The ankle sprain, high ankle sprain, 4 to 6 weeks. If you're also training to try to get back and you have all this other stuff and you're still trying to meet demands of your sport while dealing with that, like there are going to be things that come up, because at the end of the day, there is a difference when you're being paid versus when you're doing it for fun as a youth athlete or as a high school athlete.
I think the other part of that is, like you were saying, 4 to 6 weeks, let's say, for high ankle sprain. Does that mean you're fully ready at 4 to 6 weeks? No, but like the doctor says 4 to 6 weeks, and then the athletes associate that with I'm full go 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks might mean you're getting back in the field. And if you haven't done anything in 4 to 6 weeks on the field, like, would you normally take a month and a half off and then go right back to games? No, but usually people get injured in season, so that's what they think is going to happen. That's what they try to do.
Yeah, and I think that timeline often gets misrepresented. I mean, I know you've experienced that quite a bit with ACLs and tests that are done by their surgeon. And then you put them on plates and you see the asymmetries, or you see the reduction in strength, or you see the atrophy. And decisions have to be made to hold that athlete back, because we're putting them, if we were to let them go back to their sport, ultimately the chance of them re-injuring are much, much higher. And being labeled as, hey, you're clear, does not always mean, hey, you're actually good to go meet the demands of your sport.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think for me, when I have athletes come in, if they're, rehabbing an injury or they just have some pain going on that day, they're a growing athlete, whatever, the way I always try to, break it down. And when I know when I coached you up on this too, when you're starting to work with people with more injuries and all of our current coaches, it's like, first and foremost, I try to find pain-free movements. I talk to them. I'm like, hey, what makes your pain better? What makes your pain worse? I don't want to completely shut down things, right? If it's knee pain, what can we do that can still potentially build up strength in that area, but also ideally increase blood flow in that area, which we know is going to help natural healing properties. So I always go straight to usually like some type of isometric at a bigger range, not deeper range, but like a more open range of motion. So I'm thinking for knee pain, I like doing like iso split squats. I can do that really high. I can get lower. I just tell them to go as low as they can without knee pain. We can do wall sits. We can do box squats, like all that kind of shit. If that is still an issue, which typically it's not, I usually can kind of end there. I can go up and down the chain, right? So maybe there is something where I'm told I can't move that joint because of a specific injury. All right, well, we can still do ankle, we can still do hip, right? So how can we move up and down the chain to still work those areas? Too many times people will have an injury and they just shut things down completely. And I see that with all types of injuries. They'll I'm sure you've had it too, where athletes call you and like, hey coach, I sprained my ankle. Like I won't be in the gym today. And you're like, why? You have your whole upper body, you have core, you have conditioning, you have your other leg, you have your hip, you have your knee, like you have every single other joint except for that one joint. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's a big piece that's usually missed.
I think for the overall industry, I think a lot of that has kind of died down, or at least dampened an effect of, hey, if you have an injury, shut down. Like I don't see that as much anymore, really, with general population either. But yeah, like making sure, like, if one joint or one part of your body is shut down, like there are still things you can do. If you have an ACL injury on one side, like you can, for the most part, still do upper body. You can probably do your other leg. It might take a little bit to set up. You can do cardio single leg on the bike. I know that's one that you've done. I've seen it done with a guy with a torn quad. Like, there are things that you can do to work around this, especially if you are not on a huge time crunch. But I think what's an even more interesting topic is, what do you do with guys or girls in situations where they are banged up? It is a chronic injury that they've had before. It's something that they've dealt with their career, and they're in a position where they have to continue to play for the betterment of their own future. Like, that's a big question, and that takes some thinking because of that specific context.
So first off, I want to address how you just basically told me that my point was terrible.
How did I say it was terrible?
Not terrible. I'm just joking. You're saying, I was talking about how people come in sometimes and just shut stuff down. You said it doesn't happen that much anymore. I still see it a ton on my side, but you're dealing with different people where people just want to completely shut down. And Gen Pop, a lot of times you get people, oh, I sprained my ankle, I'm not going to come in for a week. Whatever.
But I guess you don't get as much pushback. Let's put it that way. There's not as much pushback.
Anyways, I'm an idiot. You're amazing. Anyways, so going back to what you were just saying about more chronic load stuff, I still go through in my head, okay, let's find pain-free movements. Let's figure out if there is anything that makes it feel better. Maybe somebody's like, oh, when I lay down, my back feels better. Or when I stand up, my back feels better. It's like, okay, what could that mean is going on, right? How can we try to change your day-to-day life to make some of those positive movements happen more often and the negative movements happen less often? Also, what can we do to try to build up? Well, I guess if it's in season, you can't really build up the load, but monitor your load. So especially in a setting like you're at, you're more closely associated with that with your athletes. You could potentially monitor the load, how many, as easy as how many innings they have. When I was with the ski team, I would look at how hard their workout was. So RPE times minutes. So if they were jumping on snow, jumping on water, hiking, for skiing for fun, working out, it could all be associated with a load. And I could have an idea of what that was because I would track that. And then we could adjust the load in the gym. So that way, if it is a chronic, let's say just knee injury from arthritis because they've had 4 ACLs because they're 29 and been skiing for 20 years, right? Nobody specific in my head. That's something where when they come in the gym, we just try to monitor where they're at, monitor the load, make sure they're not overkilling it. If they're crushing it on the hill because it was a powder day and then they had 3 competitions in a row, we're probably gonna go pretty mellow in the gym.
What do you find harder in that instance? Somebody that you have to will to do their rehab stuff and be a little unconventional and kind of go off the script of their normalized program, or someone that you have to pull back and has the attitude of, no, just because it's bothering me doesn't mean I can't work through it?
I don't know. I mean, they both have their issues. Pulling back sometimes is harder. It's definitely less often that I get that, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like more often than not, it's the person that doesn't want to put in enough work potentially, or especially in the gym, maybe, right? They put in too much work outside of the gym and then they don't want to balance it out in the gym. So when they do have those down times from a different injury, maybe they haven't hurt their shoulder, so they can't go skiing because they're not cleared and they don't want to do anything. And now their legs get fatigued or they don't put enough load in. So then they go back on the hill and now my knee starts hurting from a previous injury because I didn't do anything the last 2 months with my legs. So I see both sides of that, but yeah, pulling people back is always difficult because they have that mindset that I'm sure a lot of people listening to this probably have. And I know me and you have too, where like my hip hurts. Oh, but it's back squat day. I'm going to go squat.
Yeah.
Because I'm an idiot. And I know the difference to that. So
nobody said that we approach our own some bruises correctly.
I've gotten better now that I'm older, man. I have to. Like I don't back squat as much anymore. Box squat feels great. I go heavy sleds all the time. And for people listening, I have just chronic hip stuff going on. And it's like, again, looking back, what are the things that bother it? Okay, let's stay away from that. Doesn't mean you never have to do that. Like I literally still did a powerlifting meet and PR'd. But my training, I probably actually back squatted maybe like 5 times an entire 12-week block of training.
Yeah, and I think that's where there needs to be a nuance of like, okay, we're doing a squatting pattern, right? Like, say we have somebody with a really inflamed, pissed off, tight lower back.
We have somebody with a really inflamed, pissed off tight back.
Like, do we want to put someone like that in a position with a bar on their back, knowing that that has exacerbated that issue, or put them in a position where they're deadlifting? Probably.
No.
But does that mean we can still, thank you for that answer? There's probably still things we can do, whether it be landmine or front loaded or pitch shark or sled or ATP or anything else, ISOs, to still get a stimulus. Because at the end of the day, like, it's all about the specific adaptations to the stimulus we're trying to provide.
Yeah. I said no really loud because I think a lot of people, if they know me, probably think that I am the type of person that would want to potentially load the back because they know, I have a Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting background. And honestly, when I was a young strength coach, I don't think I was dumb enough to probably load the back when they have back stuff going on, but I probably did load people in a improper manner when they had certain things going on because that's what I knew, right? That was my background. I hadn't grown as a strength coach yet. I hadn't grown that toolbox. And, again, I talked to young strength coaches about this. It's like, you're not going to know what you don't know yet. So throughout time, you're going to pick up on things that you can do. So if this is hurting this person, here are 5, here are 10, here are 15 other exercises I can do that are going to get me relatively the same stimulus, but it's going to put me in a better position for whatever that injury might be. And that's really, I think it just takes time as a coach and experience. And that's why you just need to spend time coaching to do that kind of stuff and like learn on the fly. I think that's what makes a good coach, especially with injuries.
In learning how to deviate from your own ideology of what's best, especially when it comes to like loaded movements, right? Like if you are someone that's just going to stick to the script and put people in positions that are not as advantageous for them, like at the end of the day, is your program really working that well? Right? Like if all of it's doing is adding stress to someone and not healthy stress, like how can you say that's optimal?
Yeah. I think a good anecdotal story for me, going back to that hip injury, and that kind of caused me to have some knee pain on my opposite knee because I was probably overstressing that side because I wasn't listening to my body. And then I got to a position where like in my mind, I was the person that like I did back squats. This is how I trained. This is, I did Olympic lifting. This is how I trained. And then that got taken away from me. Right. So it's like, okay, like reassessing that was difficult as a coach, even though like I do that with my athletes all the time, but reassessing that for myself and that identity was hard. So I went into it. Okay, I'm not going to do back squats. I did box squats still, elevated box squats, so it didn't bother the areas. And then a lot of my leg strength, because lunges and single leg stuff bothered me. So a lot of my leg strength stuff went to sleds. I did heavy sled pushes for months, like heavy, and that was my strength, like 10 yards. And when I eventually came back and the knee pain was gone and I built back up to that back squat, I was PR in my back squat. So it's crazy to think how like for so long in my mind, I was in this box of like, this is the one thing I can lift because it's going to make me stronger in that one lift that I was trying to get stronger at. And then when I was shut down, I couldn't do that. And I had to do these other lifts. I still got stronger. Right. Mm-hmm. So that was a mind fuck, but that also happened when I was a really young strength coach and was for the better. Right.
What's been one of the bigger things? I know for me personally, like implementing isometrics, especially with chronic achy stuff, has been a game changer in my training and in a lot of our athletes' trainings, whether it be through like a microdose method, an everyday method, a max time method. Like I generally think that isometrics have a very solid place, and not just like a rehab or a short position or acute position or just their overall training. Like it seems to really be effective for pretty much everybody.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what I've talked about a couple of times. That's my go-to when there's chronic knee pain, since we have it so much with the knee surgeries we see here. ISO split squats, ISO whatever, just holding those positions, I think it builds up that tissue tolerance, and more importantly, it's going to help increase strength and blood flow, strength from time under tension, and then just blood flow into the area without increased stress on the joint. I think that's the biggest part. So if the joint is what's bothering you, that can help. If it is a muscle strain or a tendon strain, I think it can also help in a different manner because you're holding those positions. So it comes down to time under tension again. So yeah, I utilize that all the time. That's been one big one for me. And then, I know you see me do the, I call them Gambetta leg circuits. So Vern Gambetta was with the ski team with the White Sox, and we took his leg circuit, and I use that in my late stage injury stuff all the time for conditioning. So instead of, hey, our conditioning pieces, you're going to get on a bike or you're going to go do this X, Y, and Z, I'm going to go do the movement patterns that we just worked on strength wise with heavier weight. And we're going to do a lot of volume, body weight, maybe a weighted vest, depending on where they're at. And you're going to build up that chronic load that way, and get the body used to those movement patterns at a lighter weight. But same thing, it's just time under tension, going through movement patterns, increasing blood flow to the area. You pick as a strength coach how you want to do that, but those, I guess, pillars or basics really is how I address really any injury, honestly.
I have to ask. I have to ask. What do you feel about those who say we can prevent injuries?
Oh God, you just wanted to make me mad. Yeah, I would say. I mean, most people that I think are in this business know that that's a crock of shit. And if they don't, they probably haven't been in the business very long. But whether it's the force plate testing that me and you are big on, or any kind of objective testing, that can reduce our risks of potentially future injuries. But and we can see that from research too, but it doesn't eliminate it. So anytime I see people posting stuff about injury prevention, red flag one goes off, and they're either just selling you something or they don't know what the hell they're talking about. If they're just selling you something and that's how they can get their product out there, I think it depends on if it's a good product or not and how they're selling it. Like, I don't have a problem with somebody saying that just to get like a parent's attention, because sometimes parents don't necessarily know what their kids need, right? And they see injury prevention and they might be like, oh, that's a good program. It might be a good program. It's not going to prevent injuries, but it could reduce the chances. It could reduce the severity. I think we're going down a whole nother rabbit hole here, but I think the biggest, I'm trying to think here how I want to put this. So we know that female athletes get injured ACL rise more. It's young female athletes. And there's been so many different people talking about how and why that happens. I think the biggest factor is young female sports don't train that often, right? So if you look at, I played football, so I started training in 6th grade, which was very early. Now we have all the kids we work with now that are training that age or earlier. A lot of female athletes I worked with when I worked at SLU as a strength coach, I never touched a weight until they were in college, and they're playing D1 sports. So I think that has a lot to do with it too. So sometimes that injury prevention or that injury reduction, whatever, is just general strength training or general deceleration landing mechanics.
Yeah.
And, as much as I don't like that terminology, I can understand why people use it sometimes to potentially sell their program to parents who don't understand. Because if I say injury reduction program, it doesn't sound as sexy.
It doesn't sound as sexy. And if we want to use the word prevention, like you just said it, that you hit the nail on the head, like injury prevention, that would be a good training program, right? Like you're addressing
what get stronger.
Yes.
Control your body, get stronger.
And, the biggest risk for injury is previous injury, past history of what you've done. So taking that into effect, we have to work around that as well and understand what they're coming in with in this intake process and where they're at, not just assuming that they're healthy, because if they've been playing their sport long enough, there's probably a chance that they've been injured.
Yeah. And that's something I go back and forth on when we do ACL or when we do late stage rehab testing too. For us, it's difficult because you could have somebody that has 2 ankle sprains on one side and ACL on the other side. And yeah, they had an ankle sprain 2 years ago, but that could still be affecting them. And now it's saying that their asymmetry is good. And you're like, but are they good? I don't know what they were before. So all that stuff that shows us that, it's meant to show us the asymmetries. And I get, in a perfect world, it can help. And it does help overall, but it's still not perfect. It's still not going to prevent anything. There's so many other factors that come into play to injuries. And at the end of the day, there's no injury prevention program, because if you play sports, you're going to get injured, period. Doesn't matter what sport it is. Obviously, there's some that are higher risk than others, but if you play a sport, especially at a high level or long enough, you're going to get injured. When I worked with the ski team, I worked with free skiing, and it was a ridiculous, like 20% ACL injury rate. Literally every single person that was on that team either had already torn their ACL, was with me, or at this point now has torn their ACL multiple times. So yeah, it's unfortunately par for the course. And we could try to reduce the amount of instances and reduce the time to come back by keeping you strong, right? So if you have a good strength training background, it's a lot easier for you to come back in a better position than when you were before. So that's my 2 cents when it comes to injury. I think the only silver lining here sometimes is I've had in my career multiple athletes that have gotten injured that never saw the gym as something that could help them for their sport because it was such a skill-based sport. And the injuries opened their eyes to how weak they were and what they had to do to get back. And it almost made them, fall in love with that aspect of it for their sport. And then that just catapulted their career to a whole new level. Some of those people went on to win gold medals. And it's just, again, multiple people that I've worked with have had that happen. So if you get injured young, don't feel like your career is over because sometimes it's just a start.
Yeah, I think that's well put to end it out.
That was so profound of me. I think
Griffey's
the pre-workout is kicking in.
Griffey's over here just barking at me. So I think that's probably a good way to close this one out.
Yeah, man. All right. I'm going to go do a bunch of squats so my hip hurts now.
All right. Have fun with your layroom.
See you guys.